controversy over MP's expenses that has just arrived from statements made by Sir Peter Bottomley, who is the current Father of the House. Um, I saw a segment on GB News by Patrick Christie's addressing this, and I think Christie's was echoing what a lot of people think with this. But anyway, I'll address the comments first and then the wider issue. So actually, I'm just reading here from Wales Online. If I could just get because I think it's important often when people's quotes are taken to look at a bit more of what they actually said. But I think there will be a lot of question marks over what he said. So this is from Wales Online. The country's current longest serving MP defended banding politicians' £80,000 pay packets grim, as he said higher wages could widen the field of available candidates. Worthing West Tory MP Sir Peter Bottomley has been criticised for comments he made in an interview with New Statesman, where he claimed it was desperately difficult for newer parliamentarians to survive on the amount they are paid. MPs are currently paid £81,932 a year, which is set by the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority. So that's important to recognise that's independently set, but still in a parliamentary mechanism. They can also claim expenses to cover the cost of running an office, employing staff, having somewhere to live in London or their constituency, and travelling between Parliament and their constituency. So if you have an MP, for example, who is in Scotland or the north of England, or even the southwest of England for that matter, they're going to be travelling further than an MP who's in London or the southeast. So that's where the expenses come in. The average UK salary is currently £31,461 a year. Father of the House, Sir Peter, who has the current longest service continuing record, told the New Statesman, I take the view that being an MP is the greatest honour you can have, but a general practitioner in politics ought to be paid roughly the same as a general practitioner in medicine. Doctors are paid far too little nowadays, but if they would get roughly 100,000 a year, the equivalent for an MP to get the same standard of living would be 110,000 to 115,000 a year. It's never the right time, but if your MP isn't worth the money, it's better to change the MP than to change the money. And he said the situation is desperately difficult for his newer MPs, for newer MPs, so not his, adding, I don't know how they manage, it's really grim. Well, of course, that was the soundbite. That's the bit that people pick up on. Um, just going down a bit further down the report. Um, yeah, the remarks sparked outrage as the interview was published on the same day the £20 universal credit uplift was scrapped. And this is something many people really do rely on. Shadow Child Poverty Secretary Wes Streeting told the BBC's Radio 5 Live on Thursday that he is genuinely infuriated by the comments. The Ilford North MP said yesterday the government implemented a £20 a week cut to universal credit, which is going to clobber 5 million people, millions of whom are in work in low pay, really struggling to get by. The charities are warning that 200,000 children are going to be plunged into poverty. So excuse me for not asking your listeners to kind of get the world's smallest violin out for MPs. And of course, he is an MP. Um, we are perfectly well paid, and unfortunately, too many MPs on the Conservative side at the same time as whinging about very high, relatively high levels of pay that MPs get in this country at the same time. They're clobbering people who are losing over £1,000 a year, which is 10% of their income in some cases. He added, This is my problem with the Tories. It's not that they're evil, bad people who go into work every day thinking, how can we plunge more kids into poverty? But as Peter Bottomley's comments show, they just don't know what life is like for a hell of a lot of people in this country, and they make policies that are actively hurting people who are going out, working hard, trying to make the best for their family, and are really struggling. So Peter said he had not known when the interview would be published, but told radio station LBC that he stood by his remarks. In a debate in the House of Commons in 1977, Enoch Powell interrupted me, but I was making the point that if you could have a parliament full of church mice and you could have a parliament full of independently wealthy, what about the people in the middle? I think Bottomley is sort of trying to work his way around this, but I think the damage is done. So this is my take. I agree with Wes Streeting. I think the Tories can be absolutely tone deaf. It's not the first time and it won't be the last time. They're a party that has long struggled, despite the electoral success of recent years, despite the fact that Labour is struggling as an opposition. The Tories, I think, still have this reputation as a party for the rich, by the rich. Um, and of course, as working class Tory MPs, or rather Tories, right? But I do think they don't always help their own reputation. And this sort of tone deaf comment, any decent Tory should be, criticising Bottomley as well, not just leaving it to Labour to do that. Because when an MP comes out with a statement like that, they all get tarred with the same brush. So Wes Streeting is saying we're paid plenty, but it's already like, oh, politicians are complaining about the salary. Um, Here's my take. I think that the issue here is the optics. I don't actually think it's too much. And in this regard, I'm with Patrick Christie's on GB News. He actually argues it should be more because if you want to invest the best talent in something, you have an incentive. Well, again, a lot of people would disagree with that. They would say, well, it's enough as it is. I personally think it's probably about right. I don't think it should be more. I don't think it should necessarily be a lot less. I mean, I've heard people say MPs should get the minimum wage. I think that's ridiculous. I think it's populist because, people say, oh, they're paid too much. But I'm sorry, an MP has a lot more responsibility than a waiter, as an example. And I've been a waiter. I don't look down on waiters. It's not about that. I've been a waiter. But serving customers in a restaurant, it's it's a task. There's some responsibility involved, but it's not the same as having responsibility on legislation that could impact millions of lives. And this argument about reducing the number of MPs, again, I think it's a little bit overblown because we have 67 million people, right? We have 650 MPs. Um, if you look at the maths of that, that's roughly about right in terms of the population. I think if we were reduce that to say 300 MPs, well, obviously it means that constituencies are going to have to get bigger. And then it's a whole issue of redrawing boundaries, and that's just a lot more of a headache. And that actually works people up because you get, for example, places that are in a traditional seat, and people, resent boundary losses, and I just think that opens up a whole can of worms that doesn't need to be opened. Um, I think boundary changes should be minimal. I think the number of MPs is probably about right. I don't think it's too much actually. Um, we've got 67 million people. We have quite a high density population. Obviously, with so many people, you need parliamentarians to represent segments of the people. They're members of parliament. They're chosen from the people. This is something that's often forgotten. Um, and I think, again, there's a lot of hyperbole around the rhetoric. I mean, people say they've never had a real job in their lives. It's true that there are career politicians, but I also think that is a bit of a stereotype that's a bit outdated. I do think there is more MPs now from real world backgrounds. There are MPs who have been soldiers, there are MPs who have been nurses, there are MPs who have been teachers, there are MPs who have come from real world professions. So I think that's a little bit of an unfair, you know, sweeping claim. And it's not true. However, I also I share the anger when someone like Peter Bottomley is whining about, or rather, when he is making that statement about it being grim. Now, he said a lot of other things that were far more reasonable, but the problem is people are going to home in on that. That's the bit that's going to be remembered. So MPs need to be very careful what they say because they're legislators and they have power, and that can be seen as tone deaf because it actually is tone deaf. For someone who's just lost that universal credit uplift, and they really, really rely on it for people struggling to pay energy bills, to hear a Tory grandee talking in those terms, I think will infuriate a lot of people. And the fact he's, not acknowledging that just shows stubbornness. Um, I will say one thing though, whilst I think the issue of MPs' salary is valid for debate, I don't know what salary Patrick Christys gets on GB News. I imagine, it's a new channel, so I don't know what sort of salary that would be. I've heard BBC executives really push this point about MP salary. Now, that is pretty rich because BBC executives get paid a lot more than even the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Wherever you think of Boris Johnson, I think most people would agree that being the leader of a nation is responsibility. Um, So, everything needs to be looked at in the context of responsibility. Um, Driving a train, on the London Underground or piloting a plane is huge responsibility because you've got hundreds of lives in your hands. Hence, the salary should be high. A doctor's salary should be high, again, because they're dealing with life and death. I would argue that soldiers and nurses should be paid a lot more. And certainly, given that we have been through a deadly pandemic, that proposed 1% pay rise for nurses was an absolute slap in the face, and I think Rishi Sunak should be ashamed of that. Um, I mean, it's absolutely abhorrent, given the extremely long hours nurses work, given the abuse they put up, given that we have been through a deadly pandemic, and all the clapping for heroes and all of that. To get 1% pay rise was absolutely abhorrent. It should have been a minimum of 5%, I would say. Um, Obviously, money all has to come from somewhere, but I don't think the average person would resent a pay rise for medical personnel, certainly not nurses. Um, I think that perhaps the reason that MPs get more scrutiny than media executives and footballers is because it's the public sector, hence their public service, whereas the other professions are their enterprises, their businesses in a different way. But I do think footballers' pay is absolutely outrageous. I mean, what responsibility does a footballer have? Well, not let down his team, not let down the fans, but it's not a life and death thing. It's not something that, at least it shouldn't be something that impacts millions of lives. There are people that take the sport very seriously. BBC executives, well, there's responsibility involved because it's media, they're dealing with information, they're dealing with the power of information. So I would, yeah, there's responsibility involved, but salaries of some BBC people is absolutely outrageous and far, far, far more. I mean, if we're talking 82,000 for an MP, and that's before expenses, even including the expenses, which we'll come to in a minute, there's certain BBC people, I think Gary Lineker's on over 1 million think he's number one. Now, that is outrageous. I have nothing against the man, but that is an outrageous salary. So that is 10 times as much as an MP. And then, someone like Piers Morgan would be all over this, but what's his salary for ranting every day? So, I think there might be a valid debate around, well, there is a valid debate around this, but I don't think that wealthy media executives are the people to be pushing that debate. They're in no position to lecture because they get even more than MPs. So I think it's a bit rich for someone, in a position of Piers Morgan. And I'm not saying he specifically brought this up, but I wouldn't be surprised if he has. Sort of thing Morgan would rant about. I just don't think someone like that is in a position to do it. I mean, a lot of people would say, well, wait a second, you're getting paid this amount to just rant every day. Um, and not, I don't think someone like Piers Morgan, I mean, he's a populist. He knows how to touch nerves. He knows how to get attention. But is he worth the salary he gets? I don't know what his salary is, but certainly, I guarantee you, it will be a lot more than an MP. Um, I think the Prime Minister and senior cabinet members, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, Chancellor, of course, they should be higher than the average MP because they have more responsibility. I mean, the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, the Home Secretary of the United Kingdom, the pressure and the responsibility involved in those positions is immense. And I must admit, I think a little bit outside the box here. I think, most people just get worked up. I sort of think, well, I feel a little bit annoyed that people don't look at the pressures that they face. A lot of people say like they're useless, they're lazy, But the interesting thing is when it comes to people's own MPs, they're a little bit more charitable. I mean, if you look at sort of the social media pages of MPs, the messages from their constituents tend to be a bit more balanced, a bit more charitable than when you get these generic rants about politicians. I don't want to be misunderstood. I really do think it's tone deaf for any MP to complain about their salary. I think they get enough. I don't think it should be more. I don't necessarily think it should be less low, because, like I say, A, it's a lot of responsibility, and B, it's a difficult job. And anyone that says being an MP is easy, it's delusional, because you're under constant scrutiny of from the media. You have weight of responsibility in making decisions. Now, don't get me wrong, some MPs are lousy. They should be kicked out of office, and they're tone deaf. Um, and if they, for example, are not responding to their constituents, if they don't bother, getting back to people, if they're only interested in public opinions when it comes to election time, they should be kicked out of office. And I can understand people being really worked up for that. But I do suspect that the issue of MPs' pay is a little bit exaggerated, because I think that what they actually get is less than what a lot of people think. It's still a lot of money. I mean, my goodness, if I had 80,000 a year, I would not be whining. I absolutely would not be complaining. But I also think the average person probably thinks it's more than that. Um, they probably think they're on hundreds of thousands. Uh, Having said that, the 80,000 is before expenses. The cost and some expenses is outrageous. Apparently, it's £9,000 for things like stationery and office. Well, I suppose that you have running of an office, so there's electricity costs and there's overheads, that sort of thing. Okay, that's going to take money. I'm more sympathetic to MPs who live a long way from London. They need to travel to Westminster, as I with Southeast MPs who don't have that excuse. Um, and also, if MPs have staff, they have to pay them. So there are those things that have to be considered, right? But doctors also have staff in the sense they have assistants and so on. So there's a lot of things to consider. By doctors, I mean GPs. From what I gather, they pay um, the assistants. Um, so I just think that MPs need to be careful how they put this. When you get someone like Bottomley saying this, as a Tory grandee, that is not going to go down well. It just isn't. And he needs to understand public anger. He needs to understand how that sort of statement comes across, regardless of what he meant. I'm sure when he was saying that, it wasn't being callous. He wasn't sort of thinking, um, we're better than everyone else. But I think he was out of touch. And I think there'll be a lot of MPs who will think, oh God, this is going to be, now we're all going to be blamed. And, well, they can condemn him like Wes Streeting has done. Um, it's all about optics. So much of politics is about optics. And if an MP is complaining about a very, very comfortable salary, that's bad optics at a time when millions of people are concerned about fuel prices. They're concerned about, well, a lot of things. So, I mean, the Prime Minister has certainly been tone deaf at times when he complained, and actually it wasn't as a parliamentarian. When he was working for the Daily Telegraph, he infamously spoke about his chicken feed salary, and it was 250,000 a year, more than he gets as an MP. So, in fact, it's more than he got as Prime Minister. As Prime Minister. So I think Johnson has often been very flippant like that. In this sense, interesting, I'll just say this very quickly. Apparently, a poll suggested, I don't know if it was YouGov or another source, apparently Keir Starmer actually went down better with the public than Johnson in the conference speeches. Probably it won't make much difference in the long run, but I think Johnson, again, that Tory conference, there was too many jokes. It was too much about Johnson pitching to his base rather than thinking, well, what about the outside public? And I do think the Tories might be a little bit complacent. I think they might be saying, well, Labour's in such a mess that people are going to vote for us anyway. I think they are a bit complacent, but they shouldn't be because Starmer's a lot of things. I'm just saying this briefly because this isn't what the video's about. I think he's a lot of things. I think he's dull. I think there's times he can be morally quite weak, where he doesn't stand up for things that he should stand up for. But I don't think he's stupid. I don't think he's stupid. So, the Tories can't be complacent. Um, and I think, the Tory conference this year it was too much about, I wouldn't go so far as to compare it to um, Armin Stadt in Germany, being out of touch and kind of laughing whilst visiting flood victims. I wouldn't say it's quite on par with that, but for Johnson to just crack jokes and I don't know, it just looked like a lot of pitching to the faithful at a time when many people are concerned. We're still in a pandemic. People are very concerned about rising fuel prices. So um, I think the Tory conference was somewhat tone deaf in that sense.